There's a strange relationship going on between the weirwood trees and the moon in A Song of Ice and Fire, and today we're going to be discussing a lot of the evidence for this and trying to get to the bottom of it on some level. The others themselves even seem to be wrapped up within this magical connection somewhere, and possibly dragons as well. And the hints at all of this begin early and often in A Game of Thrones. It may not seem like much at first, but when you begin to realize how much these connections seem to pile up over the books, it really does seem like George may have been hinting at something right from the very beginning. This is often how George likes to hide his clues. He gives little hints at things with the wording that he specifically chooses to use that doesn't really stick out to you until much later when you've read much further into the story. The first line I want to point out here is when Will glimpses the others as a white shadow moving quickly throughout the woods, he thinks it may have just been some trick of the moonlight. Then later we have the shadow emerge from the dark of the wood, which connects these shadowy others to the Weirwoods, and then a few lines later in the very same paragraph, the patterns on the others' armor are compared to moonlight on water. So there's two moonlight connections to the appearance of the others in the very first time we see them, as well as multiple times where they are called shadows, as well as multiple times that they are compared to the trees, with their armor being called black as a shadow, dappled with the gray-green of the trees, as well as I said, like moonlight on the water. The other thing that George is constantly doing is making the trees feel more like they are people themselves, describing the way that they're scratching each other as scratching with wooden fingers. Even earlier in the prologue, it says that a cold wind was blowing out of the north and it made the trees rustle like living things. Then, as the Night's Watch Rangers approach the clearing where they eventually run into the others, it said how the branches of the trees are grabbing and tugging at his longsword and his cloak, almost as though the trees themselves are trying to grab and prevent them from going on further. So George is giving us these little hints as to what I think is going on, but he's doing it in such a way that in the prologue, when you first read it, they don't really stand out, and there's no way that you could ever fully piece it together until you get some more hints from later on in the books. The next chapter I want to talk about is one where I think we're at one of the most magically important areas to the endgame of the story and to the old god's magic, the Night Fort. This is of course home to one of the most magically interesting things in all of the books, which is the Black Gate, which is described as a weirwood face that has a glow coming from it like milk and moonlight. So this weirwood door that is deep underground seems to be on some level alive with light, which is a phrase that George uses at other points as well, and it is alive with light that appears to look like moonlight, drawing another little bit of a connection to the magic of the Weirwoods and the moon. Earlier on in this chapter, we also get the story of the Night King, and the woman that he glimpsed from atop the wall is described as having skin that's white as the moon and eyes like blue stars. So the further moon color connection to what is assumedly either the others or someone who is very like the others. Now, one of the best hints for what I think is possibly going on is actually given to us at a time where it's very George R. R. Martin to hide a clue, when you think it might be something rather boring and it's easy to miss, when Bran is trying to fall asleep at the Night Fort. So first we get another one of those comparisons to trees sort of like living things and very specifically like the others with the following line. Outside, the wind was sending armies of dead leaves marching across the courtyards to scratch faintly at the doors and windows. The sounds made him think of old Nan's stories. He could almost hear the ghostly sentinels calling to each other atop the wall and winding their ghostly war horns. Pale moonlight slanted down through the hole in the dome, painting the branches of the weirwood as they strained up towards the roof. It looked as if the tree was trying to catch the moon and drag it down into the well. Old gods, Bran prayed, if you hear me, don't send a dream tonight. Or if you do, make it a good dream. The gods made no answer. In my opinion, this is one of the strongest connecting lines between the Weirwoods and the moon, where it said that the tree is trying to drag down the moon and pull it into the well. By the end of this video, I think it'll make sense to you why I find that line so interesting. Now, as a quick disclaimer, whenever you bring up this moon connection in A Song of Ice and Fire, everyone instantly thinks of David Lightbringer and his theories, and I do think that on some level he's probably correct. I say on some level because I actually don't know the entirety of what David actually completely believes about the moon, and I've actually used that as a bit of an opportunity. What I mean by this is I basically only know that he thinks that the moon and moon meteors are important in causing the long night and will likely come back in our story. Now, my first thought was before I actually discuss this topic, I should probably go through and listen to everything that David's put out about the moon, but then I thought, actually, I should probably use the fact that I haven't seen all of that as a bit of an opportunity. Knowing only part of what David believes is going on with the moon and the Weirwood trees here gives me a bit of an opportunity to independently verify a lot of his findings, go back to the source material and see if I come to the same conclusions. Think of it like a bit of a science experiment. If one person runs an experiment and they get one result, and then another person reads all of their results and then tries to replicate it, well, that's not as much of a good confirmation as opposed to someone who's completely unaware of their research going and looking at the same source evidence, and if we come to the same conclusions, I would say that makes his theories even stronger than it would have if I had just, looked at everything that he's put out and followed the exact same trail of clues. So those of you who are very familiar with his theories in depth will be able to tell me how close I came to a lot of the things that he came up with, as well as point out any bits of evidence that he's covered that I might be missing. And one day I do plan to get on a live stream with David and chat about all of this, so we'll get to the bottom of any differences we have when that happens. There's just a few videos that I want to get out on the channel before I do that, and this was one of them. The video that's going to be coming after this is one of them, and then there's one final video about the endgame of A Song of Ice and Fire that I want to get complete before I go and chat with David, because then we'll be able to just talk about all of this. So I do want to make that very clear, though, that I do know David Lightbringer has basically covered all of this moon stuff in depth, and I'm not trying to steal his thunder in any way or anything like that. I just think it's a really interesting topic, and I wanted to dive into it and see if I come to basically the same conclusion or not. Also, the final thing that we're going to talk about in this video is something that I think is probably a bit of new evidence that makes this moon and tree connection much stronger, so stay tuned for that because I really do think that it's a mind-blowing thing, and the thing that I'm going to talk about last is actually the main reason I wanted to make my own video on the tree and the moon. Given the parts of his moon theory that I have heard, I do think he's pretty much hit the bullseye, and I think by the end of this video, we will be once again ringing the David Lightbringer was correct bell that I have rung many times so far in this series I've been doing. But I also do think that there might be some side points to the theory that I might have a slightly different take on, so I do think, as I said, this was an interesting topic worth me diving into on its own, and with that disclaimer out of the way, let's get back to getting to the bottom of it so that we can lay all of this out there, and you can tell me down in the comments what you think of all of it. The next thing that I want to point out is going back to the idea of the black gate being alive with light, right? It is giving off a glow that is like moonlight, and when George describes something else as alive with light, it is the sword Dawn. Dawn itself seems to be color-matched to the Weirwoods and to the others, which are also, as we've covered, matched color-wise to the moon. The line that George uses is that it was pale as milk glass and alive with light. The other time that we have something described as milk glass is when Sam stabs another. As the other is melting away and turning into mist and a puddle, the line is, beneath were bones like milk glass, pale and shiny. So the bones of the others are very directly compared to Dawn, which is, again, color-matched to all of these other things that we have been talking about through the video. The color of milk glass, moonlight, Weirwoods, Dawn, the others, the black gate, all of them seem to be connected by George. So the next thing that I want to take a look at is a bit of lore that is given to us about the moon. This is the story that Daria was told by a trader from Karth when she was working in a pleasure house. And as we know, a traveling salesman would definitely never lie to impress a pretty blonde woman he's trying to sleep with, so we can pretty much take this as solidly established fact. She says that a trader from Karth once told her that dragons came from the moon. That once there were 2 moons in the sky, but one of them wandered too close to the sun and cracked from the heat. 1,000 dragons poured forth and drank the fire of the sun. That's why dragons breathe flame. She goes on to say that one day the other moon will kiss the sun and dragons will return. Now we see the dragons return in the story, and it doesn't come from the other moon going and kissing the sun as is told in the legend, but I do think that this is actually a pretty accurate description of the general idea of what happened, because I think there is a pretty good chance, as I'm pretty sure David Lightbringer believes, that the comet that passed overhead when Daenerys hatched her dragons was likely a moon meteor, a remnant of this moon that once existed but cracked into many pieces and then caused the birth of dragons. I've talked about this in the past myself, how I think that that was one of the ways that Dany got some ancestor souls from the ancient Valyrians to inhabit her dragon eggs and bring them back to life. Essentially, what I think was going on is, at some point in the ancient past, this second moon that was in the sky was worshipped in a similar way to the Weirwood trees in the modern day. If we assume that there are dead souls within the dragons on some level or another to create them as magical beings, which I think is a reasonable assumption because only death may pay for life, and that's just how all magic works in this universe, well then, what I could see happening in the ancient past is a situation where there was a culture that essentially worshipped the moon, and their ancestors, when they would die, would go into the moon just like you go into the Weirwoods upon death, and then someone came along and destroyed the moon in some sort of grand magical spell to take power and create dragons, in the same way that someone in the ancient past may have corrupted the Weirwood net and created others to take power, and therefore this breaking of the moon and the corruption of the Weirwood net were two different events that were basically magically similar, and on the ice and fire side had similar results, the creating of an important magical power source to essentially dominate others. I really do think a reasonable reading of the entire Essosi legend of things like the Lion of the Night, and the breaking of the moon, and the blood betrayal, and all of this stuff is a situation where you had an Essosi fire magic-y long night that was created when the moon was shattered, and moon meteors fell to Earth and potentially created a long night, and potentially are the oily black stone that we see scattered around the planet that seems to be magical on some level, and potentially even the 5 forts and the giant wall over in Essos are potentially created from the remnants of this shattered moon that was brought down to Earth, oily and black because it's been corrupted, but at one point it was a second moon up in the sky that was worshipped and where dead people went into it just like the Weirwoods. This is part of why I put out a video recently about how I think there may have been multiple long nights and it may have been a localized problem. I think it would make a lot of sense that this shattering of the moon and a corruption of this place where ancestor souls went into to create dragons on the fire magic side would cause a similar long night to the potential corruption of the world tree that we see on the ice magic side when the others were potentially created. All of these people who are taking this magical power really should have probably just left nature as it was and let these dead souls rest, but when there's power to be taken, humanity will go and try to take it, no matter the consequences. George R.R. Martin loves to do this with his history, and his ancient history especially, where many things are repeating over and over again, and therefore I think multiple corruptions of these important pieces of nature to take power and causing multiple different long night type events is just another thing that would make a lot of sense if it happened more than once. In addition to this, the monsters held away by the 5 forts seem to be completely different monsters from the others that we see in Westeros. So again, I do really think that there's something to be said for the idea of a localized long night with these multiple different causes. At the very least, it seems like this has happened twice, once with the destruction or corruption of the second moon in the sky using fire magic, and once with the destruction or corruption of the world tree in its natural state, which has messed up the seasons in Westeros. Now, the entire point that we've been talking about from the beginning of this video, though, is how the Weirwoods and the moon seem to on some level or another be connected. In my opinion, it is entirely possible that there is such a strong magical connection between these Weirwood trees and the moon because they are essentially the same thing in a different point in time. If there were dead souls in the moon that was destroyed at one point to create dragons, and there are now dead souls in the Weirwoods that are being used to cast others or create others and things like that, well then it's possible to me that at one point there was an age where when you died you went into the moon, but then that was destroyed, so then after that, this magical force jumped into essentially these trees, and now you go into these world trees when you die. We see jumping of consciousness, and especially warg consciousness, in Varamir Sixskin's prologue established very well. And if the magical hive mind that seems to live within the Weirwoods is the thing that grants warging abilities, which it seems very clear in my opinion that it is, well then it would make a lot of sense that when the moon was destroyed, this giant collective hive mind would have jumped to some other vessel capable of containing it. So there may have been an age of the moon, and we are now in the age of the Weirwood tree, or the world tree, that is very close to its end, which is another thing that I've talked about, the changing of the age that I think will be coming by the end of these books. So here's where we get to the part that I really wanted to talk about, and this is the reason that I decided to make my own video on the tree and the moon. Is there anything that's happened recently that's given us the idea that George R. R. Martin may have this in mind? The idea of the moon and the world tree being different magical vessels that could essentially channel some sort of godlike consciousness and rule the world in some magical way? Well, yes, there is. And I'm sure some of you down in the comments know exactly where I'm about to go with this, because it is time to finally talk about Elden Ring lore. And we can finally talk about it because over the last few weeks I have done a deep dive, finally after having time, and yeah, it turns out that Elden Ring lore gives a ton of really strong supporting evidence to a lot of the things that I believe are on George R. R. Martin's mind, and a lot of the things that I believe are going on in A Song of Ice and Fire. Well, I haven't played Elden Ring myself. Many of you down in the comments have been very kind to point out a lot of connections that you have seen, and so now that I've had a little bit of time over the last few weeks, I have done my best deep dive on Elden Ring lore, and all I can say is I have been completely mind blown. Many of the Elden Ring lore videos I watched really do sound like they're talking about the exact same thing, just taking place in a different universe. George R. R. Martin's world building and magical system for Elden Ring seems to mirror his magical system for A Song of Ice and Fire in a lot of ways, and the next video on my channel is going to be an in-depth deep dive into a bunch of the connections that I've been able to make so far, so make sure you're subscribed and be sure to look forward to that coming in a few days. So in case the last few sentences haven't made it completely clear, this is the part of the video where we're getting into some very serious spoilers for the end of Elden Ring. If you want to remain completely unspoiled for that game, this is the part where you've got to go, I'm sorry. You'll just have to take my word for it that there's a lot of really good supporting evidence for everything I just talked about. So, alright, now that all the people who want to remain unspoiled are gone, it turns out that in Elden Ring you are in what's called the Age of the Erd Tree, which is much like the Weirwoods. They're matched. I'd talk about that more in the next episode, but basically there are many different people who you can align yourself with in order to go about destroying the Age of the Erd Tree and allowing someone else to come into power in the way that the current system of power is essentially controlling the world. You are replacing the system of power for a new age. But one of the options doesn't lead to a new age with a new world tree. Instead, if you side with Ranni the Witch, who, I would like to point out, looks a lot like the Night's Queen and has a lot of parallels to Melisandre, basically, if you side with her, what she does is she destroys the Erd Tree and says the following.
Now cometh the age of the stars. 1,000-year voyage under the wisdom of the moon. Here beginneth the chill night that encompasses all, reaching the great beyond.
So yeah, George R. R. Martin has a situation set up in Elden Ring where the moon is an acceptable stand-in for the world tree for ushering in a different age, which is what makes me feel so confident that there is a potential in A Song of Ice and Fire that the moon and the world tree were functioning in a similar way. This brings me back to the line at the Night Fort where it makes it look like the tree is trying to catch the moon and drag it down into the well. Along with all these other connections between the tree and the moon, I think we have basically two options for what is set up here between the tree and the moon in A Song of Ice and Fire. Because Elden Ring lore and A Song of Ice and Fire lore, they rhyme, they aren't exactly one-to-one parallels, but I explain that more in the next video, how you can sort of spot the differences and how you can use one to learn from the other. It's a very long video on its own, that's why I'm not going into complete detail about it here. As I said, you're just going to have to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss it. But basically what could be going on is a situation where the Weirwood tree and the moon, as I said, are the same consciousness that has just jumped from one to the other, and the moon meteors are an opportunity for another long night to happen whenever moon meteors crash into the planet, and therefore when it's hinted that the tree is trying to catch the moon and drag it down, it could be a hint that it's time for moon meteors to crash into the planet so that this world tree can die and the cycle of rebirth can happen again. Or it could be a situation where if they aren't the exact same consciousness and it hasn't jumped like a warg consciousness from the moon into the tree, perhaps these are, just like in Elden Ring, two competing options for what could control society. So the tree and the moon could be enemies on some level. In that case, the tree trying to drag down the moon into the well would be a situation where maybe the world tree is trying to defeat the last remnants of the moon that is still out there in the form of moon meteors. An ice versus fire situation going on, this war that is constantly raging between these two grand powers that are trying to control humanity. which would fit very well in my opinion with the themes of A Song of Ice and Fire. Sort of an order and chaos type situation. Maybe the moon represents on some level chaos with the moon meteors crashing down into society, whereas this all-controlling world tree could represent order, and in a similar way to the cycle of ice and fire that I've talked about in previous videos, right? The order sort of encrusts the world, traps it like ice, and then it causes fire to come and destroy it. Whereas if these are enemies, the tree is trying to drag down the moon to completely destroy the chaos that the moon brings, but basically that can never happen. So potentially by the end of our story, the order of the world tree, the order that is established and controlling the world through these Weirwoods, could eventually be destroyed by the chaos of the moon meteors. Whereas in the past, maybe when the moon was fully in charge, the moon represented order, and the destruction of the moon is the chaos thrown into that cycle, right? Whatever's in charge becomes the order, whatever's out of power is the chaos that eventually rises up to destroy the order, the ice and the fire, the balance going back and forth, that is always controlling the world. So yeah, that's a lot of stuff that might be pretty complicated and pretty heavy, and a lot of it is sort of wrapped up in a lot of mythology and symbolism, and if you don't know some Elden Ring lore, well, hold tight. As I said, there's a video coming soon, and in the meantime, definitely go check out some Elden Ring lore. But in general, I would say, yeah, there's a good chance that there's some moon meteors coming back to break up this order that has been established by the World Tree, and kicking off a cycle of rebirth a la Norse mythology. Let me know down in the comments if this connection between the moon and the tree seems as strong to you as it does to me, and if you think it functions in this similar way to potentially order and chaos and the way that it works in Elden Ring. I really look forward to reading what you have to say, and I'll be back with something else very soon.